Welcome to Functional Philosophy. I'm Charles Tew. That's T as in tango, E as in echo, and W as in whiskey. This is episode number 24, and its title is Integrated Ideas, the Right to Bear Arms, and More Jordan Peterson. Today I'm going to talk about 3 different topics. So the first topic is integrated ideas, and by that I am referring to my recent experience with feedback on the show, or people arguing with me about what I've said. I was trying to explain to someone recently that we do not have instincts, that human beings do not have instincts. We don't have innate ideas or automatic forms of knowledge. Inbuilt, innate, congenital knowledge. He did not understand this, and wanted me to just give an argument, just defend my view. The fact that he was sanguine about my ability to do that was precisely why it would have been pointless, useless. It would have made no difference if I had attempted to explain my views to him, except that it would have suggested that to do so were possible, and then when it inevitably failed, my views would have been the ones that looked as if they were damned. Now, I did explain my views, but after he didn't understand them, it was clear that much more work would have to be done if he was going to understand, and he did not understand why that was the case. So, I want to explain what's going on here and warn you against this kind of mentality. We live in a Kantian culture. By that I mean we live in a disintegrated culture. Everyone comes at questions from a case-by-case perspective, as if you can answer questions in isolation. Now, this perspective is so inculcated in people and so widespread that people don't even think of it as a perspective. That's just how things are. But it isn't just how things are, and in fact, it's a wrong perspective. Now, when you're talking about some narrow problem in physics or an engineering problem, and you take all of the background for granted, then you can talk in narrow terms and everybody will understand you, and you can proceed with things simply. That is not the case when you are discussing philosophy and everyone is on opposite premises to your own. Philosophy is so tightly integrated. For instance, metaphysics and epistemology, the basic nature of reality and how you know things. Those two subjects are so tightly connected that it is very difficult to separate them for analysis. So when you're explaining one, you inevitably get into the other. So I want to analogize this whole issue to putting together IKEA furniture. This is how I think about it. People have the IKEA furniture mentality about everything. They think, why can't you just tell me, when I'm putting together this IKEA chair, put peg A into slot B, and that's the next step. That's one of the instructions in the manual for how to put together this chair. Why can't you just tell me that? Why isn't it that simple? In the same way, this recent experience I had, this guy was asking me, why can't you just explain why human beings don't have instincts? Why can't you just defend that point? Well, I can't just defend that point because a syllogism is made up of propositions, and propositions are made up of concepts, and concepts can be valid or invalid. You have to have the right materials in order to put something together. Even the way you conceptualize knowledge, the whole issue depends on that. So if you want to understand this topic and you don't already, you have to introspect, you have to look at all of the forms of conscious experience you have to understand the principles behind separating things, and then apply that to your conscious experiences, identify one of those as knowledge, understand why you did that, and only then can you even begin to talk about the idea of innate ideas and inbuilt knowledge. If you don't already have that, if we're not already on the same page, then it's going to take a treatise to explain all of this to you. Now, he didn't understand that. It was clear he just wanted, well, why can't you just give the argument? Because the argument is not in a void. It depends on many other things. There are many premises and a lot of work that you have to do first before you can make the argument, before the argument even makes sense. Just like the IKEA furniture. If you're using cardboard instead of the slightly better than cardboard wood IKEA uses, and marshmallows instead of their little pegs, then when you try to follow the instructions in the manual, the chair's going to fall apart. And then you're going to say, well, I guess these instructions don't make sense. No, it's because the elements you were using don't make sense. So I can't just explain to you why the concept of instincts is wrong if you haven't properly conceptualized things in the first place. You have to have all the pieces right. Then I can tell you how to put them together. Now, if I attempt to tell you how to put them together, and I know you have the wrong pieces, that's just going to make me look bad. Because when it inevitably falls apart, it's going to look like I believed it could have worked. So I'm sanctioning your construction materials by even attempting to tell you how to put them together. But if I know they don't work, if I know you have the wrong materials, I shouldn't tell you how to try to put them together because there's no point. So you have to understand how tightly integrated, how interdependent things are, especially in philosophy. You can't just ask, well, why can't you just explain this narrow point? Because it's connected to everything else. And if you don't understand everything else, then I'm either going to have to explain that to you or you're going to have to go look it up yourself. And to a certain extent, you just have to observe. And then somebody can tell you how to put them together. But often there is so much work to be done that you have to do it yourself or already be on the same page, or you can pay me to teach you. But I'm not explaining all of this, especially in the space of a YouTube comment. And the fact that he was so optimistic about my ability to do that it didn't even occur to him, why can't you just defend your viewpoint? Again, that is precisely why explaining it wouldn't have done anything. Because if you're so optimistic about my ability to do it, you clearly don't understand the interconnectedness of knowledge, the hierarchical nature of knowledge. So all of that just to warn you not to have this myopic, out of context view of things. Not everything is just an equation or a put part A in location B kind of instruction. Everything is connected. Okay, so that's that. And the second thing I wanted to get to is more Jordan Peterson. I've been listening to more of him, and he is worse than I even realized at the time. He's an Eastern mystic, and as I said somewhere, I can't remember if I said this in my last episode or in one of the videos I'm about to put up, but he's just a preposterously terrible combination of false views. You couldn't create a worse combination of views if you tried. But I just wanted to comment on this one thing I heard him say. And he says, this Enlightenment view we've had since the Enlightenment, this scientific worldview, this rational worldview, it's not clear that it's practical. We did fine for thousands, hundreds of thousands of years before the Enlightenment. And we don't know how this new rational worldview is going to work out. Now, that is a psychological confession, if there ever was one. The fact that he didn't even stop to... that it didn't even occur to him to address what I'm about to say reveals the kind of person he is. It reveals his motivation. The idea that the way people existed before the Enlightenment was just fine. When people were living in poverty, ignorance, fear, slavery, working 18 hours a day, scratching in the dirt to scrape out some bare level of sustenance. They're offering sacrifices to the spirits in a desperate attempt to try to placate the unknowable forces of the world. They live in constant misery, anxiety, fear of the unknown. The idea that this constitutes doing just fine, and that we should throw out all of our modern products of the intellect in order to go back to this, I cannot imagine a more evil sentiment. I like technology. I like knowledge. I like freedom. So all of the metaphysics and epistemology and the science, the biology, the philosophy, all of that aside, this is the cash value of those abstract ideas. This is why I'm passionately against Peterson. Because all of those abstract ideas amount to this. These are the consequences of those ideas, which Peterson wants to foist upon us. And it is just an unspeakably evil thing to desire that. A kind of cowardice and rejection of the responsibility to think that motivates this is just, I can't personally relate to it. And what's strange is that Peterson himself understands this in some way. He has a kind of attenuated understanding of one of Ayn Rand's ideas, that evil is the rejection of existence, of identity. But he apparently doesn't understand that that's precisely what he is doing. Whenever he advocates getting in the flow, this Taoist idea, well, it's common to a lot of Eastern religions, he's advocating getting out of the rational space. He's advocating going back to the animal level, even though he talks about the idea of sacrifice in Christianity as naming the world-shaking idea that foregoing immediate gratification in order to get something better in the future is what is unique to human beings. And he says it's the greatest idea in human history, and in a sense it is. That is what it's all about. That's what we can do that animals can't. But he also rejects this idea in the substance of a lot of what he says. And this anti-enlightenment view is one manifestation of that. So anyway, I just wanted to draw this line so that anybody who thinks Peterson and his ideas will lead to something good will understand precisely where he's walking you to. You know, if he's your leader, this is where he's taking you. So just understand that. He wants you to go back to a time before anesthetic, before modern medical technology, before cars and the internet and everything else. All products of reason, he thinks, are dangerous because they're a product of reason, and he equates totalitarianism and authoritarianism with reason, which is just, that is a very primitive mistake. You know, he also justifies the horrific treatment of Galileo by the church. I've heard him apologize for that. As if it's okay because reason is really dangerous. So it's things like this that just disgust me and reveal where he really wants to take mankind. And that destination should be rejected in the strongest terms possible. Alright, so lastly, the right to bear arms, guns. So we've had this shooting in Las Vegas recently. So I thought now would be a good time to explain the nature of the right to own a gun. Well, the first thing to say is that yes, you do have a right to bear arms, to own a gun. Not just because the Founding Fathers said so, but because you have that right by the nature of reality. You have a right to own anything that can be used for purposes other than violating rights. Guns serve two main purposes: self-defense and hunting. Both of those are obviously valid. Now, when you get to the level of some kind of fully automatic assault rifle or a machine gun or even a sniper rifle, you do not have the right to own those kinds of weapons. Why not? Because, or a nuclear, why don't you have the right to own a nuclear missile? Because the scale of that kind of offensive power is such as is only legitimately directed by a government. You have a right to defend yourself in the interim between when the government can get involved. Now, they're not psychic. Somebody can assault you. You have to be able to defend yourself between the time you're assaulted and representatives of the government get there, the police. But you never need a nuclear bomb to fill the interim, and a sniper rifle for the same reason. If you're in a position where you can pick somebody off at the distance of a sniper rifle, you can just get the police. And a machine gun or fully automatic rifle is the same way. At a certain point there's a semi-arbitrary line. Maybe a fully automatic rifle I could be okay with, but the principle is at some point there's a line. Now, what I can say is that what is definitely within the bounds of legitimate ownership are handguns and shotguns and semi-automatic rifles at least, because those are demonstrably useful for self-defense and hunting. Now, I also have a view that guns, the right to bear arms, can also be viewed, or can be implemented as a civil right. Now, by that I mean it serves as a kind of check on the government. Now, a lot of people defend guns on the grounds that we need them to fight the government if it turns tyrannical. And a lot of people say, no, this is dumb and wrong because the government is there to defend our rights. It's a legitimate institution, and so we should not have the right to overthrow it. That's anarchy. Now, I agree, the state is a legitimate institution, and we need it to defend our rights. But the idea that guns as a check on the government necessarily means anarchy is, well, that's rationalism. That's just deduction divorced from reality. So, their idea is, the idea of these people, a lot of objectivists argue this way, the state has to have authority, and having guns for the purpose of fighting the government, well, that just defeats the purpose of the government, because the government has to have a monopoly on force. Well, this doesn't make a lot of sense. This idea breaks down under just a little bit of scrutiny. Why then do we have a separation of powers? Now, the government is limited in power by the Constitution, of course. It's limited to doing only those things it should be able to do. But beyond that, even with that limitation, there's also a check on the government in the form of division of powers and the stratification of powers, federal, state, and local. Why have that? The The Constitution already says the government can only do this, so what's the logic of limiting the ability of the government to act if you've already limited it in the Constitution to only doing what it should be doing? Well, the answer, of course, is that no piece of paper can bind anyone to anything. You have to, in fact, set things up in a way that prevents abuse of power. The idea of the Founding Fathers, and Ayn Rand endorsed this, was that even once you have the Constitution set up, there's the possibility for abuse. And so the separation of powers exists to check the tyrannical impulses that might exist in the people in power. So by the same token, if people own guns, that can serve as a check. Doesn't mean anarchy. It's just a check. So this logic that, well, people shouldn't have the right to fight back against the government because it should be doing what it's supposed to be doing, that's stupid. Because that invalidates the idea of separation of powers. I mean, why are we limiting the government to what it can do? It's just supposed to be doing what it's doing, so why are we placing this separation of powers? Why do we set up the executive against the legislature? The Constitution already says what the government should do. You're setting it up that way because you know there are going to be people involved who aren't necessarily going to do the right thing, and you want to check them, in fact. And an armed population can do the same thing. So this kind of rationalistic idea that the government exists to protect rights, and if it's not protecting rights, there's nothing you can do, that's just belied by the fact that we have a separation of powers. The whole logic of a separation of powers is to check the government that is in theory doing what it's supposed to do, but may not actually be doing what it's supposed to do. And an armed population can do the same thing. That's what I called a civil right. A right not just in the sense of this is your right, as a personal thing, but it's kind of a political right. It's a right related to, it's like voting. Voting is not a right like property is. Property is something that you have. The right to vote is a narrower technical thing. It's not justified in the same way. Theoretically, if there were a system that protected, property rights without voting, I mean, I'm open to the idea of only property-owning or land-owning citizens having the right to vote. That wouldn't violate anybody's right. You don't have the right to vote as an individual right. That's a civil right. That's just a right that works as a technical, practical check on the government. I mean, that's what voting is. It's another one of those checks on the government. But if you could protect rights without it, that would be fine. Now, I'm not totally endorsing the idea of land ownership as a good requirement for voting. There are some problems with that, but this could be tweaked. That's the kind of question you can ask. So I think guns can be viewed in the same way. The right to bear arms can be viewed as a civil right the same way as voting, as a kind of practical way of checking the government beyond, the right to own guns to defend yourself or hunt. So the second main objection, however, is that if people can overturn the decisions of the government by force because they own the guns to do so, then we just have anarchy. So what's the point of the government? This is again rationalism. Those are not the only two choices. In fact, the logic involved with guns as a civil right is exactly the same as the logic of the separation of powers. Separation of powers makes it so that the government can't do anything unless enough people agree, on the logic that this won't prevent abuses completely, but it will slow them down, make them harder. Having an armed population does the same thing. If the government is hunting down a serial killer, there are not going to be enough people who rally together in order to pose any kind of threat to the government's police and military forces. But if the government becomes truly totalitarian and actually threatens the rights of all people, that may unify people. And all of those combined guns can serve as an actual deterrent to the state. Now, it may be true that the state may still win, it may be better armed, maybe not. It would, at the very least, be a deterrent, because if they start sending in the police to force you to do things, but everyone owns a gun, short of some science fiction technology, it's hard to see, no matter how much better armed the government is, if every house they're going into is armed, it's not going to be easy. So this is the same idea as the separation of powers. And it works on the principle that people are not going to unite over something evil. But if the government truly starts doing evil things itself, then people might unite, and all those guns can serve as a legitimate deterrent. I'm not saying this is the solution to end all problems of tyranny. I'm just saying it's one practical step, and this idea that, we shouldn't have guns because the state is a legitimate function and any advocacy of the right to own guns to fight the government is anarchy. No, it's no more anarchy or anti-state than is the separation of powers in the first place. So anyway, that is just a plausible, practical proposal. It's similar to Ayn Rand's tentative proposal of a fee on contracts as a way to fund the government instead of taxation. It's just one possibility. I'm not suggesting this is the end-all, be-all, but what I am saying is there's nothing obviously wrong about it. It isn't ruled out on the grounds that it's pro-anarchy, for the reasons I explained. And anyway, aside from that, yes, you have the right to own guns for self-defense and hunting. You have the right to own any kind of weapon, so long as its abilities are not such that its only possible legitimate use is at a scale not appropriate to individual self-defense. Or, the defense of one's holdings. And if you have some theme park, you can hire security, that's fine. But even there, you don't need sniper rifles. You're not going to be fighting off armies that come to, take over your theme park if you own one. You can have security in there, but any threat at a certain scale is the province of the government, and it should be the one dealing with those things. So those are just my thoughts on guns. I will work all of these thoughts out in an essay at some point. If you have any questions about anything I've said here, you can just send me an email at charles.a.2@gmail.com. You can also visit my website at charlestew.com. There you can find links to all my work, including ways to support it. Thanks for listening. Let's meet again in episode 25.